In bed by night, I sought him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but found him not. We left off with God beckoning the soul to follow him, and the subsequent growth toward a greater and greater love of God. We are now in that place of active receptivity to God, no longer dominated by a focus on overcoming sin and developing a moral life, though that endeavor certainly is never complete. But rather, we are now in a place of growing intensity and desire for being with God, for experiencing his love and presence. It is now that the soul is worn again to have first walked the purgative way. That work of dealing with the self, with dealing with disciplines to submit the ego to the full self or human spirit, and also the ways of God, prior to attempting a premature union with God. We're told, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the does of the field, that you do not stir up or awaken love until it pleases, until it's ready. The spiritual path is one of a continuing dance of the soul with God, not allowing that the ego will want to control the process. And God will not allow that to happen. It's a dance of the soul with God not allowing the ego into that place of control, nor with God allowing the soul to stay within its own limited conceptions of itself. This dance of God is always of one where God is going before the soul, beckoning it into the fullness of its being, beckoning it to perfection and completion. A premature opening of this desire, that is a striving for the full experience of God's presence prior to dealing with one's own limitations, one's own vices, of being aware of oneself, will potentially overwhelm the unprepared ego. Persons may find themselves in one of many potential dilemmas or dangers. Just one of those dangers is that of spiritual avarice. Others might be spiritual gluttony or spiritual lust. No, it is not a lust, an avarice, a gluttony for food, sex, or worldly riches that overwhelms the ego, but a lust for God, a desire and want to grab hold of God, to want to feel filled by God. Now, this may show up in an immoderate desire for experiences from God, a sense of needing visions, wanting visions or feelings, those tinglings or deep spiritual insights that can arise and may have already touched the person to some extent. The problem with this is exactly with the word we just used. We're caught up in a want. I want for myself, where we have just seen that God will not allow the ego to grasp hold of something, to get what it wants that way. The ego is, in that place, going to be stuck, and God will not allow that, for he is about developing us into the fullest people that we can be. For that's where true joy and true happiness is to be found, in fulfillment. For the ego, though prepared by discipline, the arising of these lusts, this gluttony, even this avarice, it would seem, these feelings and this desire are actually what draws it over the hills, metaphorically, in the Song of Songs, and now in a frantic search for the beloved. For the unprepared ego, the one that in our speaking last week was about the one who wants to stay in bed and have God come into it and meet it where it's at and stay there. For that unprepared ego, the thwarting of this avarice, gluttony, lust of the spirit is experienced merely as an abandonment then. It's experienced as a form of sadism even by God. It seems like a meaningless pain. The unprepared ego essentially does stay in bed, waiting for the beloved God to come, who then never does. For he has gone ahead, drawing the soul into its true destiny. Again, this waiting becomes misery. For the ego has now learned and experienced enough that it cannot easily return to either a superficial spiritual experience nor to a denial and rejection of the reality of God. However, if it's unprepared, it also does not move forward and is still caught in its desires to have and to grasp. So the warning comes, do not be unprepared. Oh, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the does of the field, that you do not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. Do not strive for this love until you have dealt with the matter of overcoming the physical vices and are at least now becoming more consciously aware and engaged with the spiritual vices and with your own unconscious. But now for the ego that is prepared, and that's what we're trying to focus on. The ego prepared by discipline, the rising up of these spiritual experiences, what we're calling lust, avarice, and gluttony in a negative sense, but in that same sense, those feelings will be used by God to draw it over the hills and in a frantic search for the beloved. The one that's prepared is one that's already gotten into a place of humility. I will go after God. And now the feelings draw us forth there. We see this repeated again in the 5th chapter of the Song of Songs. There it says again, I slept, but my heart was awake. A sound, my beloved is knocking. Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one, for my head is now anointed with oil. And it's wet with dew, my locks with the drops of the night. Once again, God is beckoning the soul to invite Him, God, in now in an even deeper way, to an even deeper degree. But as before, it is not for the soul to rest in the peace of this love, but now to grow further, deeper in love, in wisdom, and in knowledge of the beloved. A growth that occurs the more the soul is abandoned and emptied to God. However, at this point, the soul is seeking still only rest in God. For just as it has been slumbering, now it wants God to still meet it where it is at and stay there. Now the soul, though, will be further purified, the ego purified as well, of the desire to grasp, and will be taught further how to love. We read this in the song, I had put off my garment. How could I put it on? I had bathed my feet. How could I soil them? So at first the soul is telling God to please consummate the marriage at this point and is desiring the beloved to meet it as it is now. But God will take that desire and use it to fulfill the true needs of the soul. For us and for the soul in that moment, though, the experience, the healing fulfillment that God is doing, it will experience what God is doing, which is healing and leading to perfection, the experience of a darkness, loneliness, and pain. It will believe itself abandoned by God. And earlier panic will again arise in an even more profound manner. Yes, it's put this way. My beloved put his hand to the latch, and my heart was thrilled within me. I arose to open to my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh, my fingers with liquid myrrh. On the handles of the bolt, I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had turned and gone. My soul failed me when he spoke. I sought him, but found him not. I called him, but he gave no answer. The watchmen found me as they went about the city. They beat me, they bruised me. They took away my veil, those watchmen of the walls. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, that you tell him that I am sick with love. Here we see that where the time before, when that sickness came and the and the soul jumped finally out of the bed and went over the hills looking for the beloved, the watchman helped. Now, one interpretation is that in the early stages, we need boundaries, rules. You need clear discipline. You need clear doctrine. You need assistance in order to be able to walk the path. Without it, you could get lost. But later in the spiritual life now, as we're growing even deeper in love, those same things, in a sense, we could actually say in some ways, that same religious authority that was so important and so necessary now can be constrictive. It's as if your preconceptions will be the things that will actually hurt you even as you're going along. There's a way in which one has to take the risk of being able to follow in love. Now, once again, we go back to the idea of being unprepared. If you have been unprepared for this journey, you may at this point still be floundering around in lies and delusion, things that have been called in the past heresies and the like. But if you've been prepared, all of that doctrine, all of that help, all of those disciplines, the working on yourself to overcome the vices, the becoming aware of your own unconscious and of your own soul, all of these things will now have become a part of us. And it's only then when it's a part of us that we're able to now move beyond it because it is so much a part. It's very similar to being able to hear Jesus say that he will not do away with any part of the law, but that he is the summation of the law. And now we can live in the Spirit. It's what Paul means by that level, which is once you've so incorporated the law, once you've so incorporated what God is essentially commanding, then you're able to move in the Spirit. At this point, we need to be able to release into that place rather than be stuck with our own narrow conceptions of what that law meant. And so in the earlier stages of the mystical life, we found that we had an ability to do much. We could strive to be moral. We could meditate on scripture. We could examine our lives both inner and outer. We could take time for worship, prayer, study, praise, petition, and the caring for others, all necessary and good things. But now, at this point, as we grow deeper in this life, now we're swept up and called outside of our ego. God is now beckoning and then provides the felt energy to follow him. He provides that felt energy that draws us forth, draws our hearts out. Now it is no longer us stirring up our desire, but that the desire is now welling up within us, outside even of our intentional willfulness. Feel the desire to seek God, to follow after him. But as we once again grasp for it, it is as if it's grasping a cloud. We search and we follow, leaping over the hills metaphorically in search. At times we experience, though, only a feeling of loss, the panic of the ego, having to learn to submit to God. Now, this submission is the prayer that arises at this time. A prayer St. Teresa of Avila referred to as the prayer of recollection and the prayer of quiet. It is all the soul can do is to be actively receptive. The feeling will come forth. No longer are you striving to create a desire, be disciplined in it. Earlier, in what we were referring to as the purgative way, we had to essentially discipline ourselves to desire. There would be the time when you would say, I do not feel like getting up and praying today. I do not feel like getting up and reading my Bible. I do not want to go to church. I do not really care. I'd rather stay in bed. And then you would take the discipline and say, but it's right for me to do it. It's good for me. I need to do this in order that I can continue to move forward. And so we would discipline and willfully produce the desire and then move forward. Now we don't produce it. It's as if it's being pulled forth from us. All we can do now at this point is sit in darkness, sit in the cloud of unknowing, and allow love in the heart to metaphorically leap over the hills in search of the beloved, the object of its love. Teresa would describe this prayer of recollection as the soul involuntarily closing his eyes and desiring solitude. Not out of choice, but because of God's action upon the soul. It is a time when it's not the sense of choice where I will close my eyes and I will be quiet, which comes earlier in the path. No, now it is all I want to do is just close my eyes and be quiet and in solitude. She says that the soul begins to experience what she calls a temple of solitude being built around it. She further describes it like a hedgehog or a turtle withdrawn into itself. The senses and all things external seem to gradually lose hold on the soul, while on the other hand, it's as if the soul is regaining a control of itself. First, there was the panic, but now it's as if a finding in solitude, waiting in solitude, which is no longer a panic. You're calming down. Unlike these disciplined times earlier, the soul can now not force the experience from God. It is a pure gift for which the praise and thanksgiving to God is appropriate as a response. Prayer of recollection grows even deeper into a prayer which she calls the prayer of the quiet, a form of recollection which again comes directly from God. She will tell us that this prayer of the quiet is accompanied by the greatest peace and quiet, sweetness within ourselves. And it comes with no effort. With no effort, the soul drinks directly from God and experiences an incredible feeling of peace. She then continues, as this heavenly water begins to flow from this source, it proceeds to spread within us and cause an interior dilation, which produces ineffable feelings and blessings. So once again, the soul not only cannot, it should not strive for this type of prayer, because God gives it when the soul is not thinking of it at all. However, Teresa does state that the Lord will not fail to grant this favor to the soul who reaches true humility and detachment. Now, the understanding of all of this work that has gone before to develop the virtues, especially the ultimate virtue of humility, as well as a detachment of a desires to have, want, need, grasp. For the soul that is now developed into the humility of saying it's about God and I will follow wherever God will go, to the soul that says it's not about me and gaining my blessings, to that soul, the Lord will not fail to grant this favor. This sounds all wonderful at this point, and it is. But there are times when that favor is not present. There's times when those ineffable feelings are not to be experienced. If they are gone, because it is up to God. It's not something I can hold on to. It's determined by God. And so between these times of what these Carmelites of John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila and like call the times of consolation, between these come the times when we actually can repeat with the maiden in the Song of Solomon, I opened to my beloved had turned and gone. My soul failed me when he spoke. I sought him, but found him not. I called him, but he gave no answer. Oh, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, and this is the point, that you tell him I am sick with love. This verse from the Song of Songs can be one of the many good descriptions of the dark night of the soul. The term dark night is most often attributed to the likes of St. John of the Cross, and he describes this experience as this process in the following manner. The dark night of the soul is also known as a period during which the mind, the memory, and the will are being purified. The ego is actually being now transformed at the deepest level as it encounters both its full self to which it belongs and encounters God. And in the encounter with both is confronted with the gross dissimilarity between the ego and God. The ego is not even compared to the full self, and the full self is gross dissimilarity to God. When this comes about, there's a pain in a sense. It's the pain both of the heart sickness of wanting a God and the experience of being present with God still, as well as the pain of an ego that really does not want to transform, has always been wanting. But now in its understanding of its dissimilarity, realizes that this image of God in which we were made is so dissimilar from the true God that the struggle is now to become like the likeness of God. And there is an intellectual knowledge that this must happen, while experientially and emotionally it's abandonment and pain and soul sickness. During it though, the ego and then the total soul is being transformed, thus establishing its original capacity for a full relationship with God. Without this preparation, the ego once again could be annihilated, destroyed in many ways. For as we were told, no one can look upon the face of God and live. And now we add to that, no one can look upon the face of God and live without being prepared by God himself. A preparation that is both of the consolations, but even in a sense more so, of the dark nights. And this dark night is not merely experienced during prayer time, but in everyday experiences. And it's experienced in different ways by different people, determined by the individual issues of that unique soul. But the pain endured while dealing with these issues and the subsequent purification of the soul can tempt the individual to give up on the pursuit of the spiritual life. There is a sense of true soul sickness. And here it is that St. John of the Cross tells us it is crucial to remain quiet and faithful, crucial, to crucially be sustained then by the hope and expectation in the knowledge that that purification will lead to an authentic contemplative prayer. What then is the how of this what in the mystical life? The how is to persevere in allowing that panicked love to merely flow from the heart into the imperceivable darkness where it seems to the ego that God has abandoned it. But in actuality, God is there on the other side of the ego's metaphorical wall, calling the soul to the fullness of life and relationship, which is to be found in the spiritual marriage that is now to come. Now it is that the mystical life begins the transition into the unitive way much more fully, the uniting of soul and God, the marriage feast of the Lamb. The identity begins to transition beyond the ego toward the full self. And that full self begins to recognize and experience the embrace of God. Now the soul finds that its activity is an experience of contemplation in a never-ending outflow of the self towards God, a stream of desire and love toward the beloved that now finds its fulfillment and joy. For most of us, we have to really think about this, the outflow, because most of us spend our lives looking for the flow to come in, that God would come into my life, that I would experience God in my life. But as you've walked the path, and in this Carmelite, especially in Western view of mysticism, as we have walked the purgative way and the illuminative way, entering into what is called that unitive way, that the flow is no longer desired for coming in. It is, by the grace of God, an outflow now, a stream to God. We meet this in a beautiful time of the Solomon songs. Here it is when we are able to say, I am my beloved's, and his desire is for me. Come, my beloved, let us go forth into the fields and lodge in the villages. Let us go out early to the vineyards and see whether the vines have budded, whether the grape blossoms have opened and the pomegranates are in bloom. There I will give you my love. The mandrakes give forth fragrance, and over our doors are all choice fruits, new as well as old, which I have laid up for you, O my beloved. Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. For love is strong as death, passion fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, a raging fire. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. If one offered for love all the wealth of one's house, it would be utterly scorned. Teresa of Avila summarizes well this movement on the path of love. The soul has entered the path through the practice of prayer. It needing to spend time in the developing of self-knowledge and humility. The soul spends time meditating on its own ignobility and God's goodness. It strives to set its eyes upon Christ, our good, rather than itself. Through this process, then the soul as a whole and the ego specifically transitions to a period of experiencing the highs of many phenomenal mystical experiences and the lows of many trials and afflictions. Through humility and perseverance, the soul, though, has proven to her beloved that, like a faithful marriage partner, she will be faithful in good times as well as in bad. This has led to the immediate goal of this portion of our existence. The soul now enters into spiritual marriage with God. It is penetrated to the very center of itself, where His majesty alone dwells, a place Teresa refers to as a second heaven. The soul comes by means of what she calls an intellectual vision to where the most holy Trinity reveals itself in all three persons. Here, all three persons communicate themselves to the soul and speak to the soul. Now that we've explored the experience and process of this mystical path of love, we might more easily grasp St. John of the Cross's metaphor of a progression of transformation from our base identities with the limited ego of our identity into the fullness of the likeness of God in Jesus. John of the Cross gives the example of a wet log placed into a fire. First, he tells us, before the divine fire is introduced into the substance of the soul and united with it through perfect, complete purgation and purity, its flame, which is the Holy Spirit, wounds the soul by destroying and consuming the imperfections of its bad habits. And this is the work of the Holy Spirit, in which He disposes it for divine union and transformation in God through love. John then relates, the very fire of love that afterward is united with the soul, glorifying it, is what previously assailed it by purging it. Just as the fire that penetrates a log of wood is the same that first makes an assault on the wood, wounding it with the flame, drying it out, and stripping it of its unsightly qualities, until it is so disposed that it can be penetrated and transformed into the fire. He further says that the will does not experience the savor of the flame because it does not feel this flame within itself. It only feels what it does not, but it does have within itself its own misery. And finally, this flame previously oppressed the soul in an indescribable way. Since contraries are battling contraries, God, who is all perfect, against all the imperfections of the soul. God does this so by transforming the soul into himself, he might soften, pacify, and illuminate, as does fire when it penetrates the log of wood. This fire is the fire of the burning bush of Moses. As the fire penetrates and transforms the wet log, our very being, it does so that the log and the fire can become one. But one as in the burning bush, where even in their oneness, the bush is not consumed, but transformed. Even in their oneness, the bush is not consumed, but transformed. Transformed into the human being God envisioned in the dance with him that was always proposed. With this, we come to the end of this general survey of the way of love, and we'll look next at the way of mystery.